Why is India's big jobs crisis not getting more national attention? Why aren't we talking more about the fact that millions of Indians have in fact dropped out of the workforce? I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Let me introduce our newsmaker on the program today. We are joined by economist Mahesh Vyas, whose data is painting a grim picture on unemployment and employment statistics that effectively tell us that millions of Indians have in fact lost faith in their opportunity or capacity to get a job. Welcome to the program, Mr. Vyas. And let me start by taking our viewers through some of the data that CMIE has outlined. Unemployment rates have increased from 7.8%, have increased to 7.8% from 7.12 in June. The total number of jobs fell by over 1.3 crores from May to the month of June. That's happened in 1 month. We're talking about 13 million jobs. That's a staggering number. And in fact, one has to wonder why it doesn't have more attention. From May to June, we saw the biggest decline, according to CMIE, in employment in a non lockdown month. And remember, of course, there was a greater drop in economic activity during the pandemic years, but this is the biggest decline in a non lockdown period. The biggest crisis is in rural India, where you can see the figures there. They tell their own story of how unemployment has, in fact, risen. And in urban areas, in fact, the unemployment numbers are, in fact, slightly down. There's been a slight improvement, but it's not enough to offset the crisis that is taking place in fact, rural India. So let me welcome you with these grim data points now to the program, Mr. Vyas, and ask you to tell us the big picture. What is happening here? Basically, I think your data also tells us that 10 million Indians have left the workforce. Only an additional 3 million in those 13 million jobs lost have actually signed up to be counted as unemployed. How bad is the picture?
Well, it is not as bad as the numbers make it out to be. It is true that when you talk of 13 million jobs lost in just 1 month, it's a staggering number. It's a very big number. And if you say that there's a fall of 10 million in the labor force, it's even worse. But, this is not as bad as these numbers make it out to be, because as I've explained this earlier, this is transitory. What has happened is that labor, particularly in rural India, has quit the informal jobs that were available to it in the month of May to move into Kharif sowing activities in the month of June. But the rains were delayed. And the delay in the rains have kept these people unemployed for a short while. As the rains revive, these people will get employed as agricultural laborers. So while it looks pretty alarming, it is not as bad as it appears to be. So we have also seen this. We gave out these numbers of June in the first week of July, and through the next 2 weeks, we have seen the rains have revived, and as they have revived, the labor participation rate in rural India has gone up again. And when the July numbers come out by early August, we will see the situation to be not as bad as it looks like with the June numbers.
So here's my question. If you think that this is a temporary blip, how worried should we be?
We should be worried still, in the sense that people should not be so vulnerable, even if it is for a few weeks, for the rains being delayed or for something else not happening. It just tells us that too many of us in India are employed in vulnerable, informal, disorganized sectors, and we can have a job today and lose it tomorrow, and one is never certain of the kind of wages one will get. So the worrisome part is the structural problems that India faces on the employment front. Only 20% of Indians are employed in the organized sector. The rest are all vulnerable.
One of the points that you've been making is that the unemployment data doesn't accurately, in fact, reflect the number of people without jobs. So let's pick up this one number, Mahesh, of the 13 million people, in fact, who have lost jobs, as it were, from May to June. In these 13 million, you're actually saying 10 million have simply exited the labor force market. How do you explain that, and where do these people, or what do these people turn to then?
They turn to more or less nothing. So for a few weeks, they are unemployed and they know that there are no jobs available to them. Let's take, for example, let's turn this into an example to understand what's happening. A person could be working in the non-farm sector as a casual laborer. Maybe the person was temporarily working in a market to do some odd jobs, but he or she knows that there is employment available at a better scale, at a better, maybe a slightly better wage when the rains come and sowing activities begin. So people land up over there and then they don't find the job. So what do? They wait for the rains to come, they wait for the farmers to deploy them as agricultural laborers, and when they get employed over there, the numbers do get corrected. So what happens is there's a lot of noise in the data because people are getting in and getting out of temporary informal forms of employment. This is not like everyone goes to work in the morning and comes back in the evening and has a Sunday off. This is very, very informal, and therefore the data reflects this informality of people moving in and out. We need to worry about a large section of Indians still being in the informal sector.
Yeah, but I want to go back to your idea that they're leaving the workforce. What in your research have you found would it take someone to say, I'm not even going to try looking for a job anymore?
This happens essentially amongst women. So it does not happen as much in men. The what we call as the labor force participation rate, that is the number of people who are either employed or are looking for work amongst men of the age group, let us say from 25 to 59 years of age. Around 95% of these people are in the labor markets, men between 25 and 59 years. So more or less everybody is looking for work. They're not quitting the labor markets. That number becomes extremely bad for women.
Hmm.
A very small proportion, less than 20% of them, are looking for work. Now, that number for women's participation in the labor market has dropped. What's happening is within a family, within a household, men continue to go to work. Women try to go to work, don't find enough jobs, get exasperated, and give up. They find it more useful to stay back at home than fight there. Let me give you a statistic over here. The labor participation rate for men on an average for the full set is around 65, 68% or so. I'm taking the full set.
Mhm.
And they face an unemployment rate of around 6.5% or so. So nearly 70% labor participation rate and 6.5% unemployment rate. Women, on the other hand, have a much lower labor participation rate, much, much lower, only 9%. Whereas 70% for men and 9% for women. And even with just 9% labor participation rate for women, they face a 14% unemployment rate.
Hmm.
The very few women who go out to work find it doubly more difficult to find jobs. Now, these are the people who get exasperated, they lose hopes, they find it's a hopeless world out there, it's not worth going out to look for jobs. They are the people who are leaving the labor markets.
And the data that CMIE has presented paints essentially one, of course, a gendered crisis. The female labor force participation is in fact at its lowest in decades. And put simply for our viewers, it means that fewer Indian women are working than before. But my question to you, Mahesh, is this essentially an agrarian crisis? If the rains perform better, do you expect this to go away? Or is this a post pandemic structural crisis? Which one is it?
Well, the pandemic made it just worse. It was always bad. And this is not only an agrarian crisis. the fall in female labor force participation rate is as bad in urban India and as bad amongst educated women. So it's a case of there being a serious lack of jobs which suit women. So women find it more difficult to go to work in places that are far off, getting back home when infrastructure is not entirely reliable, when street lamps don't necessarily work all the time. Women are not feeling safe going far off into work, and jobs are not always available close to your home. So, the adverse conditions under which women work is also to be taken into consideration. In spite of we producing in India more graduate women than graduate men, we find lesser educated women, graduate women, going out to seek jobs. That is a worry.
To be fair, though, the reason for fewer women or women dropping out of the workforce is not entirely related to the economy. It is also related to a whole host of social reasons. For example, being expected to juggle the home in a way that men are not expected to juggle it, and so on. But I want to come back to the meta data point: 7.8% unemployment rate, rising from 7.12%, as you said, in May. 13 million jobs have dropped in a single month. I mean, the delay in rain cannot explain all of this, Mahesh.
Most of it. In fact, almost entirely. Because the loss is not only in rural India, the loss is also in the agricultural sector. So there was really a case of rains over here. And as I told you earlier, as the rains revived towards the end of June and early July, we have seen labor participation rate in rural India bounce back. So this one, the one in June, is really a very temporary thing, which will get corrected in the month of July. We need to worry about the larger picture where employment is not rising. India employed 413 million people in 2016-17. In 2021-22, we employed only 402 million. So account for in 419-20, before the pandemic, we employed 409. So 413 dropped to 409. The pandemic brought it down to 402. So you see, the bigger problem is that India is not generating enough jobs. This 13 million job will get corrected. If it doesn't get corrected, we will study more about this. But the bigger problem is over years, we're growing at 7% or so, 6, 7, 8% or so, but we are not generating jobs.
Yeah. So, here's the question. Your data at the same time suggests a minor improvement in the urban in unemployment numbers, right? It actually says that unemployment has mildly or marginally fallen in urban areas, and it's actually risen by over a percentage point more than in rural areas. How do you explain this improvement in urban centers?
Well, there are month to month variations, and there isn't much to read over here because the unemployment rate in urban India is usually significantly higher than rural India. In the month of June, agriculture and rural India just jumped up a little bit and is the main cause for unemployment rising in the month of June. But usually, the unemployment rate in rural India is lower. It provides lots of jobs, although poor quality jobs. Urban India, on the other hand, provides better quality jobs but is unable to provide adequate jobs. So there is no great story in the unemployment rate in urban India coming down marginally in the month of June.
I want to pick up the state-wise performance on unemployment. If we can please have that slide now. The states that you have actually ranked do the worst or have done the worst in the month of June in terms of a lack of jobs. We have Haryana. Can we take the banner off? We have Haryana leading, followed closely by Rajasthan and then Jammu and Kashmir, which interestingly tells you that whether it's a BJP government or a Congress government, the problem is structural. It's related to a whole host of other factors, because one of these is a BJP government, the other is a Congress-led government. By contrast, the next slide will show us the best performing states, and there too we don't actually see any distinction based on politics, where Madhya Pradesh has the lowest unemployment rate, Puducherry follows, and then Chhattisgarh and Odisha follow close behind. Mahesh, how do you explain or categorize, like, what explains these performances, both the better performing states and the worst performing states?
You see, the unemployment rate is a slightly or a significantly misleading number. Uh, I have been asked this question regarding Haryana many a times because it tops and has been topping the states in terms of the unemployment rate. But we need to keep in mind that Haryana has a higher than average labor participation rate. A lot more people in Haryana are keen to get employment. The problem is, since a larger number of people in Haryana are seeking employment and is not able to provide it, the unemployment rate goes up. But having a high LPR is a very good thing. So I think it's important for us to take a more complete picture of each of the states and understand that Haryana has a structural issue. It has attracted a lot of labor in the recent past, in the last 10, 15 years or so. And then the growth rate may have slowed down. Investments have slowed down recently. As investments slow down, it is these regions that have attracted a lot of labor into the industrial sector that starts suffering. Industrial and services sector, basically non-farm sectors. That's the reason why Haryana shows up very high on the unemployment rate. You will have a state like Uttar Pradesh has a very low unemployment rate. It's similar to Madhya Pradesh, etc. So the unemployment rate itself is not an adequate indicator. One needs to look at the three indicators together: labor participation rate, unemployment rate, and the employment rate. One gets a more complete picture thereafter.
Uh, when you look at the crisis, then, if you say it's entirely related to let's say rains, what that could be temporary. But you've been speaking about jobs for many, many months. In fact, over the last year, what worries you? What worries you the most?
Um, it is lack of investments that generates good quality jobs. That's what worries me the most. It's not good for us to say that 10 million people left the labor market because the rains were poor. That's just not done. The crisis is not 10 million people leaving the job. The crisis is that we let this thing happen. The crisis is that only 20% of the people working in India are working in organized sector. Now, why is that? That's because India has a very low rate of investment and very low investments in labor intensive industries, which are the best industries in a sense. The ones are, you'll have petrochemicals, you'll have fertilizers, you'll have steel, you'll have power. All of them are capital hungry, and they are very, very poor on absorption of labor. You have IT, which is labor intensive, but it's very, very skilled labor. India's problem is it has a large contingent of low skilled labor. Employment in those industries is extremely poor. That's what worries me. The lack of linkage between our labor contingent and our investments is the reason why we will continue to suffer high unemployment or low labor participation rates.
Now, while all of this is happening, Mahesh, we're also seeing the fall of the rupee and against the dollar. That the government says that the RBI is taking steps, that the hit is not necessarily that big, and there is also a school of thought which actually says that the rupee should fall to its natural level. That's a contentious point in economics. I don't know where you weigh in. Let's bring up the slide that actually looks at the rupee's fall against the dollar. We now know that it has crossed the psychological 80 mark, and we have a certain forecast that are saying by the third quarter we could in fact see this number go up to about 82 rupees. That's what Nomura is predicting or forecasting for the third quarter. But we are also seeing a marginal improvement today on the day that we are talking. Mahesh, how do you see the fall of the rupee against the dollar?
Well, the fall of the rupee should not be a matter of major concern. I don't think there is any merit in saying that India should have a strong currency. India may well have a strong and strengthening currency. or it can have a depreciating currency. It depends on which way the total trade and capital flows work out. So I think what is important and what I think the RBI mostly takes care of, which is very wise as well, I think, is that the rupee should not be too volatile. So if the central bank can manage the volatility of the currency, and it can do that only to a small extent, mind you, it's extremely expensive to manage the currency. If the currency is going to depreciate, the RBI cannot intervene beyond a point to hold on to a certain value of the currency. So uh, letting the rupee find its natural value is good. I do believe in letting the markets determine which way we should be going. What's important is not to let this become too volatile, to keep it slightly predictable for traders who are dealing with currency. The hedging bets should not become too expensive. That's what I
And do
think.
you
I think,
and do you think it's basically been managed? There's a lot of debate about sort of depleting, forex reserves. The RBI obviously is stepping in to take measures. Do you believe that this has been managed in a way that it is not so volatile?
I think so. I think the RBI is doing a reasonably good job. They have intervened in the market. The data slightly dated, but tells us that they have intervened in the market. I believe it's mostly to control the volatility. They have intervened, the government has intervened in ensuring or at least motivating banks to attract more capital in as the FIIs exit, because the interest rates in US rises, and it becomes they go in for safer avenues for their money. We are trying to get more NRI money in, make it easier for corporates to borrow uh, through commercial borrowings overseas. So there are measures being taken on both sides. One is to ease capital flows so that we can offset the flow of FII money going out, and B, to control the volatility to some extent. I think this is a good combination.
Okay. I want to go back actually to the issue of unemployment. And one of the new schemes announced by the government, whether you support it or you're against it, I'm talking, of course, about the military recruitment scheme, the Agnipath scheme. And we can come out now of these slides that are looking at the rupee and return actually to the issue of employment. The military is many things in rural India. It's a source of identity, a source of honor, a source of security, but it is also a source of employment. And I completely take the point in the argument made by the military that it cannot be treated as as an unemployment exchange. That said, we've for years seen lines of young men lining up in villages hoping to get a job. That job, while still available, is now only available for 4 years. What do you think this is going to do to the already existing sort of burgeoning jobs crisis in rural India?
Well, the jobs crisis is much bigger than what the
Of course.
army
Yeah.
recruitment can do. Even if it is for 4 years or it is for a longer period, I don't think it moves the needle much. What I think is important is, number one, whether the army requires to have the one particular mix of men and machines compared to another one is for army men to decide and educate us on. My only thought on the Agniveer issue is that its introduction should have been managed better. A
Hmm.
whole lot of people in many pockets of India have been preparing to enter the armed forces for a very long time, and they had a certain understanding of what their job is, and they had an understanding of the chances of them getting into that job. That has got seriously shaken. So the confidence in the government, living up to its stated objectives earlier, or the rules of the game earlier, I think dashing those hopes was very damaging. It would have been much better if this reform had to be introduced, and as the army thinks it should be done, then it should have been done much better. And
Yeah.
dashing hopes of youngsters is not a very good thing to do. It's a difficult condition. In these difficult conditions, when you don't get jobs easily, if you even get dashed hopes, that's not a good thing to happen.
A last question to you. Why do we not see more visibility about this unemployment crisis? There are people who've disputed your data. Uh, why are we not seeing people out there saying, "I don't have a job"? Why do you think that's not happening?
See, there are two things. One, you mentioned disputed our data. That's okay. You can dispute this data and you can look at the government data. You will still see falling labor force participation rate, rising unemployment rate. All those problems are there. We are still employing a much smaller proportion of the population compared to most other economies in the world. So we can quibble over which data you want to believe, but the message from all data sets is the same. Why is there isn't much of noise about this on the political front? And
Yeah.
that's very elementary to understand. Because if you have an unemployment rate of, let us say, 7.8% or so, it is actually around 3% or so of the population that is unemployed. 3% of the population don't make much of a difference on the political front. Whereas if you have inflation shooting up, it impacts everybody.
Hmm.
So everyone will be up in arms if inflation goes up. But if unemployment goes up, it hurts very few number of people. That's the first problem. The second problem is who gets blamed when somebody is unemployed. It is the unemployed who gets blamed, not the system. The unemployed youngster is told, you didn't study hard enough, you didn't work hard enough. It's your fault you didn't get a job. Look, the neighbor's boy got a job. So there is this misunderstanding that unemployment is an individual's problem. Actually, it is an economy's problem.
Well,
Actually, the
but
economy needs
but
to grow to provide
yeah,
employment.
yeah, because you see, unemployment is linked to spending, is linked to everything. I mean, who's going to spend? Who's going to stimulate the economy if people don't have money to spend? And then I
Yes.
think there was a question in our live stream that consumer spending is not reflecting this crisis. Is that because it is essentially in rural India for now?
No, I don't think it is true that consumer spending is not reflecting this crisis. Consumer spending has tapered. Look at even the government data, which it paints a slightly rosy picture compared to what I believe. But nevertheless, in the GDP growth rate in the last few quarters, private final consumption expenditure has been the slowest to grow. It's lower than the GDP growth rate, which is a reflection of low employment and low income levels, causing a slowing down of consumption expenditure.
Yeah. So final question: what can fix this? What can make it
Investment.
better? And,
We
and who's
require
go,
a lot more
who's going to
investment.
who from the government or from the private sector?
Well, it has to start from the government, and the government is responsible not just for spurring investments, but even creating the environment that enthuses private sector to invest in a much bigger way. So I think it has to begin from the government. The government doesn't have to do all the investments. The government doesn't have to employ all the people, but it certainly is required to create the enabling environment to ensure that the private sector does aggressively invest and employ.
Well, I just want to restate the data out from Mahesh Vyas and CMIE. From May to June, unemployment actually rose from 7.12% to 7.8%. You can see that there in the data. We had a slight typo. Can we go to that graphic before? Yeah, we had a slight typo there that has mercifully been corrected now. Increased to 7.8% from 7.12% in June. And what we're actually talking about is 1.3 crores or 13 million jobs actually lost from that 1 month period. Within this, Mr. Vyas argues that 10 million people have actually simply left the labor force, and this crisis, in fact, is about women much more than men. This is the single largest decline in employment in a non lockdown month, and the crisis is very much located or centered in rural India at this point. The delay in rains could, in fact, explain that, where the numbers tell you the story about that significant increase in the unemployment rates in rural areas. The urban areas, by contrast, are in fact, as you will see in that last slide, seeing a marginal improvement, with unemployment falling from 8.21% to 7.3%. Mahesh, as we close, the sector that worries you the most in terms of jobs lost or jobs not sort of being available to capacity?
I think what worries me the most is the lack of growth in employment in the manufacturing sector. Agriculture is playing a role of absorbing labor to some extent. But what worries me most is manufacturing sector, lack of investments, lack of investment in labor-intensive manufacturing industries. That's where our hope should be anchored.
I mean, the only thing I want to say in the end is that we spend morning to evening talking about, I don't know, issues that don't concern the lives of millions and millions of Indians. And the media too has to reflect on whether we have got caught up in this deflection game. I mean, this should be the headline story every day, day after day, the state of the economy. It is one thing that whether you're Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or Sikh, what your identities are on Mandir, Masjid, Temple, Church, this is what matters in the end. And I thank you, Mahesh, for shining a light on this. Thank you very much. And we'll bring you back soon. We all follow your data closely and learn a lot from it. So thank you for your work and thank you for talking to us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.